Hello everyone! Welcome to the Overman channel where I discuss Little Nightmares theories, concepts, showcase my art, and more. Today will be another installment in my Before the Maw series following up on my ideas from the chefs. Today I will talk about Roger the janitor and his upbringing that led to his current position on the Maw. Roger was born disabled. His blindness has always been a major factor in his life. He was born screaming for hours on end. This baby was born in a miserable place he wasn't able to see. By some genetic tragedy, under the skin of his head he was born without eyes. This wasn't some normal blindness such as cataracts, or it's not like he was missing his eyes with empty eye sockets. By some strange circumstance, his skull didn't even have eye sockets. Flat bone existed where his eyes should have been, and behind his skull lay no optical nerves. He was this magical organism without any trace of having sight, save for his eyelids that led to nothing. The other fascinating part about this child's birth, unlike most children who are born head first or feet first, he was born arms first. His hands and forearms got out long before his feet ever did. He was cursed from the start, born a defect, a freak, even by nowhere standards. Standing among the other bloated or proportionate residents, he somehow exceeded the bar in terms of strangeness. His parents hated him from the start. When he was born, their faces wrinkled in disgust, and they wanted nothing more than to be rid of him. He wasn't born normal, not in a hospital with a nurse to welcome him into the world, although if he was, the nurse still wouldn't have been welcoming, but I digress. He was born in the bathtub of his parents' two-room apartment. Instead of being welcomed into the world with warm embrace, he felt cold, calloused skin and the wet end of something warm. With his blindness, his other senses were heightened, and he experienced the first scent he ever would smell: cigarette smoke. After he exited the womb, he was placed on the sink not too far from the bathtub he was born in. He was left on the cold porcelain for hours, crying non-stop. His father helped the mother out. They both moved to the other room and then proceeded to watch television. After hours of sitting in the cold sink, he distracted himself with the sounds of the television. His first sound he heard was his own screams, then the footsteps of his parents leaving him, and then the sounds of the television. This was his first memory. As time went on, his parents nursed him to a toddler stage. He slowly grew older, still frail, still cold. He was fed poorly, some cold, fibrous slop he could never discern the taste of. However, every time it was time to feed, it was a nightmare for him. Not because of the food itself, but because of the wait. He had to wait for hours while his father cooked. These delicate senses filled the air, and Roger always felt tortured knowing none of those scents were going to translate to whatever he was eating. After hearing his mother and father laugh together, talk together, have dinner together, he heard the indicator that it was time for him to eat. A loud, jarring, metallic sound. Loud for a minute, and then food was ready. Roger doesn't know. He never learns, but whatever we know to be happening is after the mother and father cook some toast, some pasta, whatever it is for dinner that night, they throw the leftovers into the garbage disposal. They sift it out of the sink, and that garbage waste slop was what was fed to him. It definitely wasn't baby food. Nothing a child should be forced to eat. Nevertheless, he grew. Once he reached past toddlerhood, he was exiled from his home. His parents decided it was time for him to be gone, putting him in some cardboard box that was subject to dry rot and was falling apart. Through some holes in the box, he felt wind whiz by him, a lovely and new sensation. It was his first time out of the house, and it will stay this way permanently. Little did he know, he was in the back of a truck, being driven to an orphanage. This strange ride came to an end at the front of a building. He was taken in. He heard two simultaneous voices talking at the same time before they picked him up in their arms and took him to a room. This room had a bed. He had never felt a bed before. He cuddled up in the bed, and his body heat slowly warmed him up. It was his first night at the orphanage, but it will be far from his last. Waking up in what he thought was the morning, he heard another child's voice for the first time. It was a girl's, like his mother's, but her tone was more high-pitched, more childlike, more of that of his own. This, he would grow to learn, was a girl named Rosie, the first friend he had ever made. Rosie had a condition of her own, some skin condition where her blood vessels were all the wrong size. Her eyelids, lips, and nose felt puffy and warm while the rest of her face felt clammy and cold. Roger grew fond of her, and she grew fond of him. The other children in the orphanage were all insecure. They all had their own issues. During the day, children were taken to a daycare center where they were taught subjects we don't really know. Roger doesn't know. Him and Rosie never paid attention. They goofed off and talked all class and often got in trouble for it. Lunchtime came around midday. The children were herded into the cafeteria. This was Roger's least favorite time of the day. Food fights occurred often, and any time he got hit with some mashed potatoes, some oatmeal, some other slop, it sent him right back to when he was a scared kid. The sounds were a sensory nightmare. The constant screaming, the constant laughing and yelling, chairs scraping on the floor, the caretakers yelling with their nasty croaking voices. Lucky for him in some regard, however, Rosie took care of him. She stood up for Roger. She took care of him in some regard. If anyone picked on him, she would get violent, and she'd beat them to a pulp. Rosie had anger issues, and she tried to manage her outbursts herself, but all people are flawed, and those in the nowhere more so than others. She was prone to yelling and shouting, but knowing Roger hated the sound, she tried her best to keep quiet around him. One night, after supper, they were all put back into their rooms. Roger, feeling around like usual, discovered some loose bricks on the wall under his bed. He pushed them away and quietly snuck out. He was alone, out in the city. Or so he thought. He couldn't see anything. He was actually in a back alley, fully blocked off from the city. Somehow the city planners blocked in this small section, and it was used as a dump that never got emptied. Roger spent all night outside. He dug through the trash, fully free, having fun. For once in his life, he felt excited. After digging around through the rubble for hours, not getting any sleep, he found something. Something warm and fuzzy, but something with holes? Holes that fit his head, or hands? It felt like a shirt, but unlike the one he was always wearing, this one wasn't falling apart. The textures were different. This one was thick and cozy. His current one was thin and drafty. The biggest thing Roger noticed, the sleeves went all the way to his wrists. He'd never seen this before. Or, I should say, felt this. A long-sleeved shirt, baggy on him, but ultimately very cozy. This was his now. Now, his frail body was protected from the cold. Digging through the trash again, he wanted to find something to solve the issue of the shirt being too baggy. It fit his long arms, but went way past his torso. He couldn't wear this long, dress-like shirt. He'd trip all the time. He dug through the trash, looking for something sharp. He'd always been artsy, despite never having access to any medium of it. During the daycare classes, he would play with pencils, breaking them in half, crumpling up paper balls, doing what he could without ever having to see it. After a long time of searching, he found a pair of rusty scissors. That night, he was ecstatic. No longer was he cold, and he had a project to work on. He finally had some semblance of warmth. He had something to keep him warm that wasn't the bed back in the room. He could wear this all the time. He could keep himself warm all the time. And once he solved the issue of it being too long, this was perfect. This was the perfect thing to find for little old Roger. However, he lost track of time, and this victory of his was interrupted by the sounds of rustling feet and then a shrill shriek. He recognized the sound as Rosie's, so he called out, stumbling along the garbage and the rubble, back to the hole he emerged from. He crawled back inside, and he told Rosie of his findings, his shirt and the scissors. Rosie then offered to trim the shirt for him. After all, she could see what she was doing. This shirt now meant something to him. It reminded him of her, a symbol of their friendship, the only friendship both outcasts had ever formed. This cycle went on for years. This loop of Roger sneaking out every other night, sometimes during the day. He had become somewhat popular, grown a lot from his first nights in the orphanage. He became a rebel who got in trouble but wasn't bothered by the non-existent punishments and hollow scolding from the caretakers. As time went on, he gathered more trash and gave it to Rosie. Both of them grew to love doing arts and crafts. Rosie would get buttons, sew them to pieces of fabric, sometimes try and sew them onto her own clothes. Roger would just crumple up balls of paper, or he would try and sew, but then he'd prick himself. It was a lot harder for him, but he eventually found a rhythm. Rosie was too big to fit through the hole, but she always loved putting her head up to the hole in the wall and watching Roger rummage. Both of them shouting to each other, having fun. One night, the trash piled higher than usual. Roger was outside, like usual. He had conquered this pile of trash, standing on top of it until it started to rain. Rosie got nervous, and she started to urge Roger to get back inside. However, he didn't listen. He wanted to bask in the rain. It was cold, but this nature was welcoming. He reached up into the sky, trying to feel the water, trying to feel the raindrops, and then he did feel something. Metal? Some kind of metal pipe stretching from building to building. At this point, Rosie grew restless, yelling at him to get back inside. Her calm demeanor snapped, and she got very angry very fast. Roger let go of the pipe, slipping down the hill where Rosie reached through and dragged him inside of the building. She beat him hard. She bruised his arms, broke his teeth, and hurt him like nobody ever had. Then she stopped. She snapped out of her trance and started apologizing, started crying, trying to console Roger, trying to talk to him, trying to help him, but it was of no use. He lay on the floor, holding himself, shaking. She tried to touch his shoulder, but he sprung to life and buried himself under the covers of his bed, refusing to talk to Rosie. It wasn't morning yet. It was the middle of the night, and Rosie was being loud. Too loud for the caretakers to not notice. As she lay in the middle of the floor, crying, begging Roger to look at her, begging him to talk to her, they hear the door unlock. The caretakers open the door. Angrily, they grab Rosie by the wrists and drag her outside, her scream slowly fading as Roger lay under the covers, shaking, crying, holding himself as he desperately tries to fall asleep. The next day was tense. Roger was scared, shaking, alone. He didn't say a word all day, not reacting to anything, just shaking. The caretakers ignored him. The other children did their thing. All was the same, but for Roger, his life turned upside down. Over the course of a night, everything he knew, everything he cared about was gone. He was betrayed. That night, he would investigate the pipe. He will find out why Rosie got so mad at him investigating it. Nightfall came. He was sent back to his room, alone. We don't know what happened to Rosie, but unlike Roger, she was very much unable to evade punishment. Once the caretakers locked the door, Roger snuck out. He ran to the garbage, climbing over one of the brick walls that trapped this garbage chute, this strange formation, some oversight of the city planners. All this time, he could have escaped. If only he had known. He was out in the city now, alone at night. He ran, he stumbled over things, he was sore and damp from the rain from the night before, especially sore from the beating he endured. He ran so fast, so far, until his poor little legs gave out, and he passed out on the side of the road. He lay, face planted on the damp sidewalk, panting, hyperventilating, thinking this was the end of him. His eyelids closed. He thought it was the end, until the rain came back, as if to tell him he can rest, he can be at peace. That calm feeling swept over him, one last wave of euphoria. as he started to fade away, till he heard a voice. A soft voice, a charming one. Could this be what awaits him after death? Wait, no. He heard someone say, "Open your eyes." He did, not seeing anything, but feeling new. He sat up and reached out into the dark. A person was there, reaching out to him. He clasped both hands around hers, and she picked him up. He hugged her. She was much bigger than him, and she was carrying him over her shoulder, him wrapping his arms around her neck. This stranger had saved his life in the dead of night. Feeling at ease, he closed his eyes and drifted away into unconsciousness. Some years passed. The lady that saved him was the current geisha of this place called the Maw. She told him once he grew up, he has a place now. He can feel at home here. He grew on the Maw, eventually getting employed in the prison. He wanted to take care of children in a way he was never taken care of. Eventually, some tragedy struck upstairs. Word got out that the geisha was dead. She was usurped by a new crown. This ruler was much quieter, much more reserved. He paid no mind, but this new geisha started changing things. Somehow the prison actually improved. He got his own workshops. The children got toys, better bed sheets, better food. This place somehow seemed even more like a dream. Unbeknownst to him, tragedy was about to strike. The lady was installing new technology involving cages and crates to help Roger with the children. This was supposed to help him. While construction was happening, a spare cage took a nosedive straight onto the back of Roger's skull. It hit hard, tearing through the skin, roughing him up really bad. He was dizzy, his head spinning, and he felt his skull get colder. His skin tore and fell over his eyelids, the back of his skull now donning a nasty crack. He can't seem to remember what happened. Where was he? He remembered a job. He was a janitor. He worked with children. He knew that much. The layout of the Maw was too deeply ingrained in his head, like autopilot, much as his role on the Maw, to have been wiped from his memory. Of all the things, he retained that, his love for taking care of children, his way around the Maw, all of this stuck, but his name, he can't remember his name. What was existence before the Maw? Was this all there was? He dared not ponder. He didn't want to know. To him now, the Maw was everything. Before going back to work, he donned a hat to cover his nasty fractured skull. He went back to work as if nothing had ever happened. With long-forgotten things from long-forgotten places, he fled the world and found the Maw. Now, as the janitor, he is a tall tale hiding in the shadows, stalking the silence, a monster alone. Thank you for watching. I hope you enjoyed this little exploration of Roger's backstory. Like the video, comment your thoughts, and subscribe for more. Thank you.